I'm Sam. I'm a security engineer at Airbnb. I mostly focus on our user endpoints and user access to our systems and data. I was asked to talk a little bit about what our environment looks like, so it could give you more context into what we have. So we're primarily Mac OS and Chrome OS environment, but we do have a small amount of Windows on the desktop. And then our server infrastructure is nearly all Linux. So we do have a small amount of Windows, but it's large enough to not ignore anymore. So I want to step back in time and go all the way back to 2014 when osquery was announced. So I think the CSS on this page has been updated in the last 5 years. But back in 2014, the end of 2014, I was invited to a meeting. I don't really remember who was there, but the result of it was that I ended up starting to use osquery. This was at my previous employer. And it was really interesting at the time, but I don't think we really knew what osquery was then. It was a tool, obviously, but what did it mean? We didn't really know. We knew it could give us some information that we maybe were lacking, but we could have gotten most of that information through like Factor with Puppet or so many other ways, but it was just a new interface, a new way to approach this. But there was a lot of stuff that wasn't there yet. There was no packs, no TLS endpoints, no real outputs other than like the file system or syslog. Everything was just kind of local, and it was very fresh and very new. The number of tables was a fraction of what there is today, but it was like a really interesting thing. And so the Airbnb information security team was really getting built out around 2015. Prior to that, it existed, but it wasn't very many people. And a few of us started on that team mid to late 2015. And I'm trying to figure out what an analogy is here, but when you have 4 people starting a team who have like 6 months of experience with this brand new thing, and you're all excited about it, like it's just really special. And we all knew that we really wanted to use osquery as part of our detection capabilities to give us more information about our endpoints. We knew we really wanted to use this. And we learned a lot along the way. But the first thing that we learned was that we didn't have any way to ship logs. There's no log emoji, so we got a tree. So, like I said before, osquery at the time, it was pretty much just file system and syslog capabilities of having an output. So, if you couldn't do that, then you were kind of stuck. So, we didn't have anything like a Splunk forwarder on our laptops. There was just nothing there. So we experimented with these things for, I think it was probably 2 or 3 months, evaluating, traditional collection tools. And I think what we really learned there was that we didn't want to deploy 2 agents to achieve this one goal. So we decided to take a different approach. And by the middle of 2016, we published this blog post on Medium about introducing AWS Kinesis as an output in StreamAlert, or sorry, not in StreamAlert, in osquery. And what this meant was that we truly turned things upside down. Traditionally, and I think for most of the chats that I've had here over the past couple of days, most osquery deployments are still outputting locally and then having something else collect it. But we're doing it in the opposite manner, where we have osquery send its own results, and we also have osquery pick up syslog for what we want from that. So we have one agent And osquery ends up being like a traditional log collection tool, but that's just one of its small features. It's so much more to us. But why did we have AWS Kinesis support added to osquery? Like, why that specifically? We could have just maybe had osquery send directly to Splunk or some other tool like that. But what we were really doing was developing a new tool called StreamAlert, which can take inputs from a bunch of different sources, do real-time processing of them, and store all those results somewhere. But also, it can, if it's processed something and needs to take an action, it can do so. So alerting is a big part of this. That's why it's got alert in the name. And that's how it's been for quite a while. So we started sending our osquery results through StreamAlert, and if there was something that was abnormal, we could send that alert to Slack or PagerDuty or wherever, really any API at all. And then StreamAlert was open source, and it's all posted on GitHub, and there's quite a few companies who are using this today. So we established an infrastructure for osquery that was really kind of different than was in operation previously, and I don't think would have existed at all had we had traditional log collection tools on our endpoints. But it's really kind of the basis for what osquery became at Airbnb. So what does osquery look like now? We've got a bunch of cool technology. We've got StreamAlert. We can deploy queries through our configuration management tools. We can parse tons of data. We don't just parse osquery data through StreamAlert. We parse all kinds of things. But what does it really mean to have osquery? Well, I have osquery on my system, but what does that really mean to a user? And that's what we really wanted to think about. So user might open up Activity Monitor on their Mac and see these processes going around. Sometimes they'll see osquery taking up, a whole bunch of their CPU, but that only happens once a day because the query gets blacklisted for 24 hours, as we found out yesterday. I've got some work to do, but we want the users of systems to see value in osquery if they care. But it's not just laptops, it's people running servers. Like if you have osquery on your whole production fleet, it's going to be taking up resources. You don't want your users to see no value in that. But the reality is that the majority of our users are never ever going to know what osquery is or most other security tools if you're doing your job right. But what this is really about is user experience and perception. I don't know if I spelled that right. Perception, whatever. So the 99% of your users that are never going to look in their activity monitor aren't your problem. It's the 1% of your users who are going to do that and are going to start a trend of, start rumors. There's going to be things going around like, this is an evil tool, it's bad. And I think osquery lets us solve these problems. So what are the kinds of problems that we actually do deal with traditional security tools? A lot of them are black boxes. It's hard for you to know what they do. They can be really hard to debug if they're just closed source. Like, let's say you update your Macs every year and your vendors kind of lag behind. Like it's hard to step through and find where bugs are if everything's closed source. But I think the biggest problem with traditional security tools is kind of two things, maybe one thing. And what you might think that it is that traditional security tools make your computer hot all the time and take away all of your battery. But I think the actual biggest problem is the lack of transparency in them. So if security tools are taking away 10% of your battery, that could be worth it. But if you don't know why that is, then that really becomes a problem. So osquery makes transparency possible because of the way that it operates, or at least the way that we operate it. And that's especially due to its SQL interface as well as osquery being present. So let's say that you've made the controversial decision to deploy all of the packs that come in the osquery repo to your fleet. Maybe they're samples, maybe they're recommended things. There's a whole controversy behind that, but let's say you've done that. So that's going to end up being on the disk on your Mac, and any user can go see what gets run, and they can even open up osquery and run that same query, and they're going to see what's going to be reported back. And the ability to do this is probably the biggest reason why osquery can succeed in environments where black box tools cannot, because users that truly care can see exactly the data that's going to be collected. But what about what data is collected? So let's say you've opened up this nice new office and you're having Wi-Fi problems. Well, you can look at a lot of things from the Wi-Fi controller side and see like maybe there's roaming issues or signal issues. Like a lot of the stuff is hard to debug, but you want to collect some of this data from your local endpoints. So there's a couple tables in osquery that could help you here. We've talked about Wi-Fi status and Wi-Fi survey a bunch. And so you might end up with a query like select star from Wi-Fi status in your packs that runs all the time. But what you really need to think about here is, do I need to be collecting this data? Does it really matter to your company which Wi-Fi networks your systems are connecting to? We've talked about BSSID in a couple talks so far, but SSID can be significant too. And personally, I don't think it really matters what networks you're connecting to when you're not in the office. So if you're going through this, consider whether you actually need this information and to pare down your SQL queries to the things that you might actually reasonably need. So if you could reasonably need the data, go ahead and collect it. Otherwise, reconsider it, because this is transparent. If you need more data later, go ahead and collect it. But the SQL interface here makes it just so easy to just collect the simple pieces of information that you need. So there's a lot of things that are built into osquery, and something that we've moved into are extensions. And I was talking to quite a few people here. It seems like maybe like a quarter of people have messed around with osquery extensions, and this has become very interesting to us for a couple of reasons. We have like configuration management tools or other pieces of configuration or software on our Macs that aren't directly queryable through osquery, or maybe you need to shell out to get the proper information, such as like MDM status. And the extensions interface in osquery has become very powerful for us. And something that I wanted to point out was something that we worked with Trail of Bits on, and this was announced about 1.5 years ago. And this is an extension to manage firewalls with osquery. Now, like, I've thought about this a lot. I still don't know how I feel about changing the state of a system with osquery. But I think the ability to do that is very interesting, and I think there's a lot of applications where this could be very compelling. If you have really good configuration management tools, managing firewalls with osquery might not make sense for you. But you can do very reactive things with it. So we've played around with some other extensions that can change state of the machine. But we have a whole bunch of tables that come from custom extensions, which are really good for us. So that's kind of what we've been messing around with osquery with in the last couple years since we've got this pipeline in place. But what are we going to do in the future with osquery? So I think the most important thing for me with osquery in the future is for it to not just be a security tool. I think most of the people here are security engineers or something close to that. But osquery can provide a ton of value for teams who aren't necessarily directly information security or something similar. So a case that I want to talk about here is Apple MDM. So most companies will use some commercial MDM. MDM is really required to manage your Mac in 2020. If you're still managing Macs with that MDM, I wish you luck. But what we've decided to do is use an open source MDM called MicroMDM. Now MicroMDM isn't really an MDM, it's more of a layer between the MDM protocol and you. So we need to be able to tell MDM what to do. Now, why do you need to be able to tell MDM what to do? Is because most configuration profiles or many configuration profiles that you use on the Mac, they just set things one time. Now, your Mac might show that a configuration profile is present and that it did this thing, but you don't know if that is still the same state today. So you can query things back to the MDM protocol, but it's not that flexible. It's not going to give you all the information you need. You can query, say, installed packages, but what those packages actually do, you don't really know, if that's still the case. So what if you need to reinstall an application through MDM? So we released a tool called MDM Director, which attempts to do things in a more kind of like configuration management way, where MDM Director will talk to MicroMDM and instruct it to do things. And what I really want to do is have this plug into osquery. So MDM Director will say, hey, go install this profile. And for many profiles, that's good enough. We know that the Mac's probably not going to deviate from it. But some profiles, say if it installs a certificate, that certificate could get deleted, but the profile will still be there. We would use osquery to query whether the certificate's still present, and if it's not, then we use MDM to install it. Because root agents can't do everything anymore, but MDM largely can. So that's something that we're really exploring doing, is being able to better inform our MDM on what to do, rather than just like most commercial MDMs having things just go one time and your fleet just deviates and you have no idea. So another thing that we're thinking about is Chrome OS. So like I said before, we have a large Chrome OS fleet, but osquery doesn't really run on Chrome OS. But maybe it does, because maybe this is the year of Linux on the desktop. I've been hearing this forever, but it might actually be. So if you don't know, Google has added Linux container support to Chrome OS. So that's pretty interesting. But what's really even more interesting is if you look at recent commits in the Chromium source code, you can see that Google has added Ansible support to manage these Linux containers through Chrome device policy. So what do you think we're going to install with Ansible? osquery, of course. So that'll be pretty cool. Obviously, it's only going to get you the data from the container, but that's really important to us. So this is the last and probably most interesting thing of things that we want to do with osquery, things that we're working on with osquery. So I don't know if I'm really one for buzzwords, but everyone's talking about like zero trust and beyond corp and all this stuff. And we've started to really get into this by using Google's identity-aware proxy as well as context-aware access to G Suite applications and applications behind Google's identity-aware proxy. This has a ton of benefits. I was part of a talk with Google Cloud Next last year, which talks all about this. But the interesting part here is that Google will natively support reporting some basic device state to its own APIs, basically like what the OS version is, whether it's like got encryption enabled, and like its serial number, but that's kind of it. We want to be able to have much deeper information to be able to control access to our applications. So we have StreamAlert already, and that's receiving data from osquery all the time. And that can talk to any API. So it can talk to Google's BeyondCorp API to update information about our devices based on query state to control access to various applications. And we can be very flexible with this by saying, like, different states can deviate by different amounts. So, like within the BeyondCorp API, you can create a bunch of different tags or a bunch of different keys and store different types of values in there. So you can store timestamps, and then you can set up your rule sets for different kind of apps. So if some application's not updated, they might lose access to one thing, like one component of G Suite, but maybe not some other thing. So this is kind of what I think osquery means for us in the future, is that it moves beyond just like this alerting tool, but does actionable things. Especially as our fleet moves forward and we have so many less users connecting to VPNs and kind of these older tools. So we can elevate user experience by giving them faster, easier access to things, but also have much more dynamic state control for access to them. So that's all I got. And I think we're really excited by what the future of osquery looks like. There's all kinds of new possibilities with things like the endpoint security framework in Catalina, and now that there's finally an API for unified logging on macOS, there's all kinds of cool stuff that we can do. So if you're interested in any of this stuff, we're hiring, come talk to me, but that's all I got. Thank you.